What if the most dangerous phase for a political system is not when it collapses in a sudden and dramatic fashion, but when it continues to operate as though everything is normal while its underlying foundations slowly weaken? Many people instinctively assume that the global order unravels through visible shocks. We think of wars, revolutions, coups, market meltdowns, or regime change. We expect instability to make a loud entrance, to announce itself in a way that cannot be ignored. But history often tells a different and far more unsettling story. Some of the most powerful transformations happen quietly, at moments when institutions still appear to function, yet the principles that once gave them meaning have already begun to shift. We like to believe that sovereignty is something fixed and stable, that states are protected by their borders, that leaders are shielded by the offices they occupy, and that political disputes are handled through recognized diplomatic channels. This belief has shaped expectations about global order for decades. It reassures ordinary citizens that power remains bounded, predictable, and ultimately guided by accepted norms. But what happens if sovereignty is no longer absolute and has instead become conditional? What if real authority now depends less on territorial control and more on vulnerability to legal systems, access to financial networks, and alignment with broader systemic forces? In such a world, power does not need to arrive through conquest. It does not need to overthrow governments openly or justify itself through ideology. Instead, it moves through procedures, regulations, jurisdictions, and institutions that present themselves as neutral or technical, while carrying deeply political consequences. This raises an uncomfortable and easily overlooked question. Are we watching the rise of a new form of pressure or coercion that leaves behind no battlefield, no declaration, and no obvious breaking point? Only outcomes that cannot be undone. If political leaders can be weakened or sidelined without armies ever being deployed, if economic lifelines can be redirected without formal sanctions, if legitimacy can be withdrawn through mechanisms that appear legal or bureaucratic, then the structure of the international order has already evolved into something new. The real danger lies not in any single example, but in the precedent such actions create. When tools meant for crime prevention, regulatory oversight, or financial governance begin to be used as instruments of geopolitical struggle, the line between governance and domination grows increasingly thin. What appears to be continuity may instead be a gradual transition toward a system that advantages those who control networks and institutions over those who merely control territory. This is not primarily a moral argument, it is a structural one. Systems change when the tools that previously sustained them cease to deliver desired results. When this turning point arrives, the new methods rarely announce themselves. The unsettling thought is that we may already be living in such a transition, only recognizing it fully once its logic has become deeply embedded and nearly impossible to reverse. To understand why this matters, it helps to shift attention away from individual leaders or isolated incidents and instead examine the global system as a whole. The issue at stake is not the fate of one government or figure, but the changing mechanics through which power is exercised, constrained, and legitimized in a world that is increasingly fragmented. The post-Cold War system rested on a delicate balance. Countries were expected, at least formally, to respect sovereignty. Economic integration was promoted as a pathway to mutual gain. Enforcement of norms tended to lean more on persuasion, incentives, and deterrence than on coercion. That balance is now under strain. Economic globalization has not produced political uniformity. Instead, it has created profound asymmetries. Some states control the world's key financial arteries, legal hubs, and reserve currencies. Others depend on their continued access to those same systems. This imbalance matters because global order now operates less through universal rules and more through selective enforcement of those rules. The ability to grant or deny market access, banking support, insurance coverage, shipping capacity, or legal protection is increasingly central to power. These instruments function continuously rather than episodically. They shape behavior long before open crises ever surface. From the standpoint of economic stability, This introduces a new kind of risk. Markets depend on rules that are predictable and applied consistently. When influence flows through discretionary legal interpretations or jurisdictional claims that stretch beyond borders, uncertainty increases. Investors hesitate. Long-term planning weakens. Capital does not simply seek productivity, it seeks alignment with power. Traditional forms of strength, military capacity, geography, population size, still matter. But they are no longer sufficient on their own. Influence increasingly rests on systemic positioning. Who defines standards, who manages payments, who determines legality, and who has the capacity to enforce decisions internationally. Those embedded at the core of global networks gain leverage. Those at the margins face structural disadvantage, even if they possess natural resources or internal authority. Vulnerability begins to concentrate among states with narrowly structured economies, weak institutions, or limited alternatives. The most serious effects do not always appear immediately. They accumulate slowly. Governments find their policy options narrowing. Instead of long-term planning, leaders focus on crisis management and risk avoidance. Power becomes more centralized, not always out of intent, but as an adaptation to uncertainty. Informal networks displace formal institutions. Transparency fades. Accountability weakens. Markets respond in comparable ways, not through instant collapse, but through delay and hesitation. Investment shrinks or seeks only short-term gains. Borrowing costs rise. Capital flows become cautious or extractive. Domestic firms move activity offshore or underground, while foreign investors demand guarantees or stay away entirely. The economy continues functioning, but at a lower level of capacity and with greater fragility. For citizens, the effects register in everyday life. Jobs become less secure. Prices fluctuate more sharply. Public services gradually erode. Trust in institutions declines, not in spectacular crises, but through accumulated frustration as systems appear opaque and unresponsive. Emigration becomes a rational choice, not only for the desperate, but for the educated and skilled. Over time, social cohesion weakens, not abruptly, but persistently. This gradualism is precisely what makes the moment so difficult to recognize. The system keeps operating. Laws remain in place, governments function, markets trade. Yet beneath the surface, the rules governing power, legitimacy, and access are being rewritten. The larger global picture reflects this same pattern. Power increasingly works through legal exposure, regulatory oversight, financial leverage, and institutional reach. Responsibility becomes diffuse. Decisions emerge not from a single office, but from overlapping systems: courts, regulators, banks, compliance frameworks, multilateral bodies. This makes accountability harder to locate and slows correction when mistakes occur. Miscalculations linger. Pressure becomes structural rather than temporary. None of this means that outcomes are predetermined. Human agency still matters. But as complexity expands, the ability of any single actor to steer events declines. Control gives way to management. Management gives way to adaptation. Stability, when it exists, is conditional. Disruption, when it arrives, may come gradually rather than suddenly. The greatest dangers come not from overt shocks, but from misplaced certainty. From confusing leverage with control, or procedure with legitimacy. We may ultimately look back on this period as a hinge point, one in which the basic architecture of global order shifted quietly, through accumulated precedents rather than singular events. And as history often shows, societies tend to realize the full significance of such transitions only once they are already embedded in daily life and extremely difficult to reverse. What remains unresolved is whether this evolving system can maintain both stability and legitimacy over time, or whether it is sowing the seeds of deeper and more systemic disruption ahead. The answer will likely emerge not through dramatic announcements, but through the slow and uneven consequences of choices being made across institutions, markets, and governments today.